Nobody speaks to Corrado Malacarne that way, especially not a waitress, and certainly not in Sicilian. He'd been convinced she was just some Roman girl with smooth skin and deaf ears, until his crude pickup line came hurling back at him, translated, razor-edged, in thick dialect. "You're an idiot, but you're lucky you're so damn hot." He smiled, felt the walls close in. "Say it again," this time looking at me. And over the weeks that follow, Serafina will discover that there are two things worse than an obsessed mafia boss. A mafia boss who's been betrayed, and a mafia boss who has just uncovered her secret. Chapter 1. The Wrong Pickup Line. The plastic curtain smacked against my back as I pushed through the rear door of Pesca del Santo, the one no outsider ever guessed was hiding behind the refrigerated display cases of the fish shop. The hallway was tight, the light a sickly yellow, and the heat from the dining room slammed into me the second I crossed through the cold storage. The Cortile Rosso was full for a Wednesday night. The cracked red floor tiles shone under the low-slung light fixtures, and the wood on the tabletops had darkened with every year I'd spent there. 3 years without calling in sick once. 3 years of chin down, tray up, and ears trained to play deaf. I slipped into the locker room, a windowless box squeezed between the pantry wall and a pipe, and checked the jar of ginger cookies tucked inside my backpack. The owner was convinced they were for low blood pressure. Juicy, my coworker covering the other half of the floor, swore they were some leftover habit from my nursing days. Both of them were wrong. The cookies were for the nausea that crept up without permission, for the heartburn that hit mid-shift, for the exact moment the stench of fish bled through the wall, and I had to fake being fine. I pressed my palm flat against my stomach for just a second, and the locker room door drifted shut behind me. 10 weeks I'd been hauling into that bar with me every single night. I still remembered the morning I saw the second line on the test. I was sitting on the bathroom floor with a towel draped over my shoulders, hair dripping, and on the other side of that news, no one. The person who should have been there wasn't, couldn't be, and I was slowly starting to understand that this child was going to grow up with me and me alone, without a father to split the shock. The apron cinched around my waist without pulling tight. I'd bought it 2 sizes up on purpose. I stepped out of the locker room and eased into my shift. The first hour rolled by without trouble. Shots of grappa, an aperitivo, 2 customers going at it over soccer. Juicy held down her side of the room, and the back table, the one neither of us approached without being summoned, sat empty. It was past midnight when the temperature inside the Cortile Rosso shifted. 4 men walked in through the plastic curtain together, none of them in a hurry. I recognized 2, Ruggiero, the city capo, and Nardo, who ran the port at Ostia. The third was a shadow posted against the wall, arms folded, eyes scanning everything at once. The fourth pulled out the chair at the head of the back table and lowered himself into it with the ease of a man who already knew the seat belonged to him. I didn't need a name. The ring on his pinky did all the talking. Matte gold, a blade crossed over an olive branch. Corrado Malacarne. I'd waited on his table 6 times in the past few months, always from a safe distance, always without catching his eye. This was the first time he'd shown up after midnight. Juicy bumped my shoulder near the counter. "That table's yours tonight." Why? Because the Don asked for the waitress from the corner. She gave a half shrug and walked off to greet a couple at the door. By the time I reached the table, the 4 of them had dropped their voices, and the first sign that tonight would be different came right there, in the language. They'd switched. Deep Sicilian, old-school Palermo, the same dialect my grandmother used to speak with me back home in Catania. Nonna taught me to cook, to pray, and to listen, and the first rule was simple. If you understand, you don't interrupt. I grew up hearing the men in the neighborhood talk, and not a single one of them ever figured out I caught every word. Inside the Cortile Rosso, it was the same deal. 3 years of mi scusi signore, in clean, neutral Italian. They assumed I was Roman. I let them believe it, because the money was decent, and silence was my side of the bargain. I started laying out the glasses. Ruggiero ordered grappa. Nardo went with water and whiskey. The shadow raised one hand and waved it off. I wouldn't learn until later that his name was Sicilian, but that night, he was just the man who seemed to be watching everything at once. Corrado still hadn't ordered. As I leaned forward to set Nardo's glass down, Ruggiero muttered something to Nardo in dialect about my waist, something about the shape, the color of my skin showing above the apron. I gripped the glass harder than necessary and kept pouring, because Nonna also taught me that anger served hot is anger wasted. That was when Corrado looked at me for the first time. His eyes were a shade of brown that edged into black, and the scar near the corner of his lip surfaced as a smile started forming. There was nothing playful about it, just calculation, the patience of a man who'd already picked his next line and was just deciding when to drop it. He dropped it. In Sicilian, slow. I'd eat that girl whole, right down to the bone. Ruggiero chuckled under his breath. Nardo let out a short whistle between his teeth. The shadow against the wall didn't flinch. I finished setting the glass down. My hand didn't tremble, which, looking back, still amazes me. I wiped my fingers on the rag tucked into my apron and raised my face for the first time all night. His eyes were already locked on mine. That certainty at the corner of his mouth hadn't moved an inch. I drew one breath, steady, because Nonna always said a sharp Sicilian is answered in Sicilian with a sharper point, and never, under any circumstances, in a rush. You're an idiot, but you're lucky you're so damn hot. The whole table froze. Ruggiero stopped laughing mid-exhale. Nardo whipped his head around like a man who'd just heard a gunshot from the next block. Sicilian, the shadow, cracked the first smile of his evening, tight, closed-lipped, barely there, but it was there. And Corrado, across the table, stared at me with his jaw clenched and his lips still parted around the last syllable of a joke that hadn't landed the way he'd planned. I straightened my back. I lowered the tray. I was already mapping my route to the counter when the chair scraped against the tile. He stood up slowly. He filled space in a way that shrank the entire room. And I, a woman who does not back down, took half a step backward before I caught myself. His hand found my arm without squeezing, just closed around my wrist over the fabric of my sleeve. His thumb grazed my skin, and I felt the cold weight of the ring drag across the inside of my wrist. He brought his face down to mine, close enough for me to catch the scent of expensive whiskey he hadn't ordered yet but already wore on his shirt. Close enough for me to understand that his voice, when he chose it, could sink lower than a whisper. "Say it again," he said, in Italian this time, clean, stripped of any dialect. This time, looking at me, I looked, and I ran, not gracefully. I pivoted sideways, launched the tray toward the counter in a motion Juicy caught mid-air before the dishes could shatter, and tore across the floor with the rag still knotted in my apron. The kitchen door slammed behind me. The reek of frying oil hit and my stomach lurched. I pressed my chin to the hand still stained from the cloth and pushed down the hallway toward the locker room. My backpack was hanging on the hook. I ripped it down and tore the side strap in the process. I didn't care. I threw open the back door, the one that led to the service alley, and the Trastevere night greeted me with a cold gust that bit into my flushed face. I ran, 3 blocks. I vaulted the low railing of a shuttered piazza, cut through the alley beside the abandoned market, and only stopped when my legs refused to take the next step. I pressed my shoulder against a peeling wall, one hand over my belly on top of my coat, and tried to recall the name of the street I was standing on. A cab rounded the corner without me flagging it down. I raised my arm. It pulled over. I climbed into the back seat, and when the driver asked where to, I opened my mouth 3 times before I managed to push out the name of my neighborhood. Testaccio, I said, the word coming out chopped, like I'd forgotten my own language. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass of the window. My hand stayed on my belly, steady, and I only noticed I was trembling when the driver glanced at me in the rear view and asked if I wanted him to call somebody. "No," I said. "Just get me home." Home was the 3rd-floor walk-up in a building with cracked tilework. Miriam, my friend and roommate, was still up, because Miriam is always the last person to switch off the kitchen light. She heard the door before I'd even finished pulling the key from the lock. I barely had time to drop my backpack on the floor. I bolted to the bathroom, hit my knees in front of the toilet, and threw up for the 2nd time that day. Miriam appeared in the doorway holding her mug of black coffee and a handful of salt, her hair pinned up in a bun that was already falling apart. "Serafina," she said, my name cracked in half by worry. "Did the guy from the bar hit you?" I lifted my face. Sour mouth, damp forehead, hand still pressed to my belly on instinct. Miriam was staring at me with the gravity she usually hid behind a smile she only ever used when she was trying to calm me down. I took a deep breath. I tried to laugh. Nothing came. "Worse," I said. "He saw." Miriam set the mug down. Her smile disappeared, and I shut my eyes, because if I kept them open, I was going to have to explain which of the 2 things he saw was the one making me shake, the Sicilian I'd hurled in the face of the most dangerous man in Rome, or the look he'd fired back, the look of a man who has no intention of letting it go. Chapter 2. Ridiculous Escapes. I missed 2 shifts back to back. The first night I called in with a fake migraine. The second, the flu. Halfway through the afternoon on the third day, while she was going over the month's budget notebook, Miriam looked up at me from behind her mug and said I had to go back. Rent was due by the end of the week. The prenatal appointment was due at the start of the next. There was no room to argue. I came in through the cold room at the usual time. Behind the counter, Juicy glanced at me and smiled with her lips pressed together. They're at the usual table. Corrado was at the back table, but this time he'd shifted to the side, facing the kitchen door. The table was full. The man with the crossed arms from last time, Sicilian, as Juicy told me that night, an Irishman raised in Palermo, was posted in his usual corner. Beside Corrado, a fine wool scarf tucked inside his suit jacket, sat Ettore Brancaleone, consigliere to the Don's father, a Palermo veteran, a man who barely spoke, and when he did, killed. I served the table. Corrado didn't call me by name. He ordered a whiskey and went back to his conversation. I stepped away. I breathed. I worked the next hour on the far side of the floor. It was all going to be fine, until he noticed the thing I didn't want him to notice. Midway through my shift, I forced a bad step on my right foot and buckled over with invented pain. A sprain. I whispered to Juicy to cover the back table for a few minutes, and I limped down the hallway toward the restrooms. When I opened my eyes, he was there, standing at the mouth of the hallway, shoulder pressed to the wall, 2 strides away. "Which foot?" he asked. I lifted the left one. Reflex. Bad instinct. Wrong. The sprained foot was supposed to be the right. His gaze dropped to the wrong foot, came back up, settled on mine. "Last time," he said, his voice lower, "you ran out on that foot." I didn't answer. He closed the gap by half a step. His hand rose to the height of my shoulder, hung in the air, and fell back without finishing the motion. "I'm not here to push you," he said. "I'm here to let you know that Juicy isn't working our table tonight, because I asked for you. I don't need to be asked for." The scar at the corner of his lip pulled into something close to a smile without quite making it there. "You'd rather be dismissed?" He stepped back with a steady motion, turned his shoulder and walked away. He stopped in the middle of the hallway without looking back. "I'll wait for you to pour the next bottle. In your own time." I poured it. He didn't call me again. He drank slowly, talked with Ettore, and left without settling the check, because men like him never pay in front of others. In the locker room, the bar owner knocked on the door and handed me a stiff card, bone-colored, folded once, black, firm handwriting, the gold crest stamped in the bottom corner. "The waitress from the corner. Do not reassign her." The weekend came before I could process any of it. Miriam knocked on my bedroom door with the market list, and I went downstairs with her to the Mercato di Testaccio. It was at the fig stand that I decided to tell her. "Miriam, he sent me a note." "Who?" "The boss." Miriam stopped squeezing the figs. She looked at me. She looked at the figs. She looked at me again. A vendor shouted the price of oranges 3 stalls down, and neither of us heard him. "The boss boss?" "The boss boss. Hold on. I need coffee for this." She grabbed an espresso at the stand next door, knocked it back in one shot, and came back, nudging the shopping bag aside with her foot. "Tell me everything." I told it in pieces, with my back to the market traffic, my voice low enough to keep it from becoming gossip for the woman at the cheese stall, the look, the hallway, the hand that almost touched and didn't, the note. Miriam listened to all of it, snatched a fig, bit off half, and said, still chewing, "I've got 3 solutions. First, you move into the convent with the poor Clares. 3 meals a day, mandatory silence. No obsessed Sicilian is going to agree to kidnap a nun." I laughed. Quick, but I laughed. Second is you pretend you're already married. Fake wedding ring from the Chinese shop on the corner. Third is the best. You pretend you only speak Russian. If he talks Sicilian, you shrug. If he talks Italian, you shrug. If he talks Russian, you shrug too, because his Russian is going to be awful. I laughed for real. A laugh that started deep in my belly and climbed up, the kind that reminded me of the days when I used to laugh for simple reasons, and then it died. I rested my hand on the side of my dress, right over the spot where my belly was starting to hint at what was still a secret, and my whole body reminded me why the laughter couldn't last. Miriam saw it. She wiped her hands on her own dress, and looked at me with none of the joking left. "Serafina, you're 10 weeks in. Sooner or later, that apron is going to stop covering." I didn't answer. I took the bag from her hand and kept walking, because walking was still easier than talking about what I was about to lose the ability to hide. It was at the corner of my building that I stopped. A black car sat parked against the curb, tinted windows, heavy doors, armored. Not a model from the neighborhood. "You know that car?" Miriam asked. "No." We crossed the last few meters in silence. I opened the building door, and before stepping inside, on impulse, I turned my head. The car was still there. No window rolled down. Nobody stepped out. When the living room light came on and Miriam pulled the curtain aside, I heard the engine below. The car pulled away, and I pressed my forehead against the refrigerator door because I needed something cold against my face to remind me that the world outside still existed. Chapter 3. The hallway. A few days passed before I saw Corrado again. I worked 2 nights with the back table sitting empty. The note in the owner's pocket was still in play. He told me, without much fanfare, that as long as that card existed, I was the waitress for that table, period. But the table stayed empty, and I worked with the practiced calm of someone who breathes easier when the danger isn't in the room. On the 3rd night, he came back. I was gathering glasses at the counter when I felt the temperature on the floor shift. I didn't look at the door. I didn't need to. Juicy passed behind me and brushed my elbow with her fingertips for just a second, long enough to confirm what my skin had already picked up. Corrado sat in the same angled position as last time, facing the kitchen door, back to the wall, a sightline that let nothing get past him. Sicilian was in his usual corner, standing, arms hanging loose at his sides this time, which struck me as worse than crossed, because loose hands are hands that are free. The other 2 were faces I didn't recognize, and Ettore wasn't there. I served the table. Corrado didn't call me by name. He didn't hold his gaze on me any longer than he had to. He ordered a whiskey, and went back to talking with the man on his left. Sicilian waved off a drink with the same short gesture as always. I stepped away. I breathed. I worked the entire next hour on the far side of the floor, covering tables that asked for nothing beyond wine and manners. It was all going to work. I was going to get through the night without crossing the invisible line I'd drawn for myself between the counter and that back table, until my body decided for me. The nausea came without warning. Not the mild kind I could manage with ginger and steady breathing. This was the other one, the heavy kind, the kind that rises from the pit of your stomach and rams against your throat. I dropped the tray on the counter with a clatter Juicy heard from the other side, and I didn't wait for a signal or permission. I walked fast toward the restroom hallway, the only exit available, because throwing up behind the counter in front of 40 customers was not something my pride was willing to accept. The hallway was narrow, badly lit, with a single yellowish bulb on the ceiling that flickered every 20 seconds. I passed the ladies' room door, which was locked from inside, and I leaned against the opposite wall, hand clamped over my mouth, counting the seconds for the nausea to pass. When I opened my eyes, he was at the mouth of the hallway. I didn't see him stand up. I didn't hear footsteps. Corrado was standing in the entrance with his left shoulder against the door frame, legs crossed at the ankle, head tilted slightly to one side, watching me with the unbearable calm of a man who'd gotten there before I'd even noticed he'd left the table. The nausea receded. I don't know if it was relief or shock. "You speak my language better than half the people in my own house," he said in Italian this time, his voice low and unhurried. "And still you run." I took my hand off my mouth. I straightened my spine. The wall was cold against my back, and the air in the hallway was thick with detergent and silence. "Maybe I'm running because of that," I answered, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. He pushed off the doorframe. He took a step. He stopped. He stood halfway down the hallway, at a distance that was too close to be casual and far enough that I had no excuse to back up. The bulb flickered, threw a shadow across the right side of his face, and for a second I saw the scar at his lip in full. No beard to soften it. "I'm not going to trap you in this hallway," he said. "You're between me and the exit. I'm between you and the floor. The back exit is behind you." I turned my head on reflex. He was right. The back door was 3 steps behind me, on the left side, iron bar unlocked. He'd positioned himself in the exact spot where I could leave if I wanted to, and would only stay if I chose to. And I didn't leave. He saw it. He registered it. His eyes left mine for a fraction of a second, not down to my body, but to my hands, which hung open at my sides, neither advancing nor retreating. He took another step, and the distance between us shrank to where I could feel the heat coming off the fabric of his shirt. It wasn't cologne. It was warm skin, starched cloth, and something underneath I couldn't name that made me curl the fingers of my right hand against the seam of my apron. "I don't know what you're doing here," I said, low, and the sentence came out fractured because the air wasn't cooperating. "I know," he answered. "I'm doing something very stupid." And he smiled. For the first time since I'd known him, the smile wasn't calculated. It wasn't half a smile. It wasn't the ghost of a smile. It wasn't the scar twitching in that almost way. It was a full smile, open, one that climbed all the way to his eyes and stayed there for 2 seconds before he himself realized what he'd done. And before the smile could disappear, before he could snap back to the control he wore the same way he wore his tailored suits, he kissed me. It was fast, barely 2 seconds. His mouth pressed against mine with a firm, brief pressure, and the taste was whiskey, and a held-back urgency that knocked me off balance inside my own body. I felt the cold wall at my back, and the warm mouth at my front, and when he pulled away, my face was flushed, and I had no words available in any of the languages I spoke. He stepped back half a step. His breathing was a shade heavier than before, and his right hand, which I hadn't seen move, was closed at his side, knuckles white with tension. "I'll wait until you stop running," he said. His voice was low and deep, and there was something in it that wasn't an order. It was a request. And he left, without looking back, without waiting for an answer. He turned his shoulder, crossed the hallway, and disappeared onto the floor before I could get my breath back. I stayed there for another 2 minutes, my mouth buzzing, my hand wringing the apron, my heart beating in all the wrong places, in my throat, my wrists, my belly, everywhere it had no business being. The next morning, I couldn't hide it. Miriam was in the kitchen before me, which was unusual, with the table set for 2 and a pitcher of orange juice she swore was a cure for any kind of nausea. I dropped into the chair with my stomach in knots and my forehead in my hands. The first wave hit before the coffee had a chance to cool. Miriam looked at me over the mug, the black coffee with salt she'd been drinking since her first year of nursing school. Her eye was clinical when it wanted to be. "The nausea's getting worse," she said. It wasn't a question. "A little. Serafina, a little is when you make a face. This is you nearly throwing up on the kitchen table. How long has it been like this?" "A few days." She set the mug down, crossed her arms, looked at me the way only Miriam looked at me, with that blend of worry and irritation that meant I was going to hear the truth whether I liked it or not. "I'm going to ask you something, and you're going to answer without making up an excuse." She waited for me to lift my face. "What are you going to do when that belly starts showing?" "I don't know. You work at a bar run by the Sicilian Mafia. The boss of that bar sent you a note with the family crest on it. You're pregnant by a man who's no longer in your life, and the money that pays for this table, this orange, and this roof comes from that floor. What exactly about your plan is sustainable, Serafina?" I swallowed hard. She was right, and I hated it when she was right, because Miriam didn't have the slightest interest in being right a little at a time. "I'll work as long as I can," I said. "As long as you can is weeks, not months." "I know. And Malakarn? What about him?" "Serafina, he kissed you in a hallway." I opened my mouth and closed it without a sound. Miriam raised an eyebrow and waited. I dropped my forehead onto the table because it was the coldest surface in the kitchen. "I'm pregnant by another man, Miriam. Pregnant. And the Mafia boss is kissing me in bar hallways. If I told my grandmother this, she'd make the sign of the cross and ship me off to the nearest convent. See? I already suggested that. I need to eat, Miriam. Convents serve meals." I laughed with my forehead still on the table. Miriam smiled with the mug pressed to her lips, and for a second the apartment felt light, almost livable, almost a place where 2 women in their late 20s could pretend life wasn't crumbling around them. The second passed. The next night, I went back to the Cortile Rosso. Corrado was at the back table, and this time the table was nearly empty. Just him and Sicilian. Sicilian on his feet, leaned against the wall beside the door to the hallway that led to the back. Corrado with an untouched glass in front of him, reading something on his phone with his brow furrowed. I served 2 tables, picked up 3 glasses, avoided the back table, and then Juicy came by with the tray balanced on her shoulder and the message I'd been expecting. "He wants to see you in the office." "The office?" "His office. In the back." I looked past Juicy's shoulder toward the back table. Corrado wasn't there anymore. The chair pulled out, the empty glass, the space occupied by no one. I tucked the cloth into my waistband, drew 1 breath through my nose, and stepped out from behind the counter. The floor felt longer than ever as I crossed the space between the tables to the back hallway. Sicilian pushed off the wall when he saw me coming and fell into step at my side, 2 paces behind, following me down the narrow corridor to a dark wooden door I'd never been through. He stopped in front of the door, turned his face toward me, and said the only line he spoke that entire night of my life. "If he scares you, you yell. I'll hear from out here." I looked at him. His face was serious, his eyes were calm, and there was a genuine kind of protection wrapped in humor so dry I almost didn't catch it. I nodded. He opened the door, let me through, and stayed on the other side. The office was smaller than I'd pictured. A heavy wooden desk, a bookshelf lined with books that didn't look decorative, 2 worn leather armchairs, and a sofa against the side wall. The light was low, cast by a brass lamp with a green shade, and the smell was old paper and strong coffee. Corrado stood with his back to me, pouring 2 glasses on a narrow tray beside the bookshelf, the white shirt without the suit jacket, the sleeves buttoned at the cuffs, the heavy ring catching the amber glow of the lamp. He didn't turn around when I walked in. "Close the door," he said, without raising his voice. I closed it, pressed my forehead against the wood for a second, breathed, and turned around. "You wanted to see me," I said, folding my arms for lack of a better place to put my hands. "I wanted to offer you a coffee." He turned around with the 2 glasses, held one out, "and ask you a few questions. I don't have to answer." "I know." He sat in the armchair, the glass balanced on his thigh, and looked at me with that calm I was starting to learn how to read. "Sit." I sat on the sofa, not in the armchair across from him, because that would have been an interview. On the sofa, where the distance was sideways and the angle was different, and where I could pretend I was just resting in the middle of a shift. The brass lamp threw an amber light between us that made the office feel smaller than it was. He asked me about my family. I lied through half of it, the coffee cooling between my hands. I said I was from Catania, that my grandmother raised me, that my mother lived far away and didn't call often. True. I said I didn't have any siblings. True. I said I'd come to Rome to study nursing. True. He listened to every answer, holding the glass without drinking, and I realized he was storing information the same way he stored whiskey, slowly, without wasting a drop. "And now?" he asked. "A nurse pouring grappa at a Trastevere bar? What changed?" "Everything," I said, and the word came out heavier than I'd meant it to. He didn't push. He set the glass on the table beside the armchair and stood. I felt the air shift before he moved, and when he stepped closer, I didn't step back. He stopped in front of the sofa, looking down at me, and held out his hand. I took his hand. He pulled me up in a slow motion, no force, and when I was standing in front of him, close enough for the heat of his body to reach my skin through my blouse, he rested his hand on the side of my waist and held it there. He didn't push. He didn't pull. He waited. I leaned my back against the arm of the sofa. His hand traveled up from my waist to the curve of my ribs, and his fingers passed over the fabric of the apron with a slowness that made me close my eyes. His mouth found my neck. Not a kiss, a brush, the tip of his nose tracing the line of my jaw up to my ear. I felt my legs give, and I braced against him on instinct, both hands flat on his chest, feeling the heat and the solidity of his body through the fabric. His other hand traveled down my leg, over the jeans, slowly, and his thumb traced the inside seam of my thigh in a motion that pulled a sound out of me I hadn't planned. The leather of the sofa creaked softly as I leaned back against the armrest, and then I felt it, the bulk of the apron against his hip, the double layer of fabric hiding what I needed to hide, pressed between our bodies, so present that I could feel the difference in thickness between my belly and the rest. Cold sweat covered my hands in a second. I froze. "Wait," I said, and my voice came out cracked. "I can't. Not today." He stopped. His hand stayed where it was. His eyes came up to my face. "I'm on my period," I said, and the lie scorched my throat because I'm a terrible liar, and Corrado is the last man on earth you should lie to badly. He looked at me for a beat longer than he should have. I saw in his eyes that he didn't believe me, but I also saw that he wasn't going to push. His hand came off my leg. He stepped back. He straightened his shirt cuff with a slow, precise motion. "All right," he said, his voice controlled. "Another day." But something in him shifted. I don't know what. I can't pin down the word. His jaw locked in a different way as he moved away, and his eyes, which before had looked at me with desire and curiosity, now had a third thing in them I couldn't read. I walked out of the office with my heart in my throat and my hands damp. In the hallway, Sicilian wasn't there anymore. In his place, sitting in an armchair against the wall, legs crossed and jacket buttoned to the second button, was a man I hadn't seen come into the bar, but who walked into every room without anyone noticing. Ettore Brancaleone, the Don's father's consigliere, the Palermo veteran who must have slipped in through the back while I was locked in that office. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. He just tracked my face with his eyes as I passed, with the patience of a man putting together a puzzle in no hurry, and I felt the weight of that gaze on my back, until I turned the corner of the hallway and disappeared onto the floor. I didn't know, and there was no way to know that night, that before dawn, Ettore would knock on the door of Corrado's office and say, in the voice of a man who doesn't repeat himself, "The girl is not what she seems. Be careful." Chapter 4. A Two-Handed Trap. What I'm about to tell now, I didn't witness myself. I was asleep in my apartment in Testaccio when it happened, hand on my belly, face buried in the pillow, because the nausea was easier when I slept on my stomach, even though every pregnancy guide on the planet said the opposite. Corrado told me later, in a voice that made no effort to soften any of it, and I believed every last detail, because that was how he talked, when he had no intention of shielding me from the truth. The morning after what happened in the office, Ettore Brancaleone showed up early at the Malacarne villa. The villa sat on the Via Appia Antica, outside the city, on an old property hemmed in by tall pines that hid the perimeter wall from the road. On the south side, there was a lemon grove planted by Corrado's grandmother, and the house itself was pale stone, with tall windows overlooking a lawn nobody crossed without permission. Corrado had lived there alone since taking over the family, except for his mother, who kept her own wing and left for mass before anyone else was awake. Ettore found Corrado in the second-floor study, standing by the window, coffee in hand, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. He hadn't slept. Ettore sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited, because men with 61 years of service don't ask permission, and said, with the economy of words that made him feared, "The waitress. She understands everything, and someone's paying her for it." Corrado didn't respond. He stayed facing the window, coffee still in his hand. "Beppe Torrisi," Ettore continued. "He's paid her rent 4 times over the past few months, and it wasn't charity." Beppe Torrisi, the name I carried around inside my own head, with the taste of dirty coin on my tongue. Ettore wasn't wrong. Torrisi paid my rent, and I paid him back with information. Who walked into the Cortile Rosso, who walked out, how much they drank, who they spoke to. It was blackmail of the simplest kind, from a simple man. He'd stumbled onto me by chance, figured out where I worked and what I could hear, and offered me a deal that wasn't a deal. It was a threat with a receipt. Former lieutenant to the Malacarne family, cast out for stealing money that wasn't his, surviving on petty scams and on my obedience. I hated every cent he deposited. But those cents covered part of the rent. Never the whole thing. Never on time. Never without me having to make up the difference with tips and extra shifts. The prenatal appointments, the bills, the box of diapers I'd started stashing in the hallway closet, all of that came from my own sweat, not his money. And I had no choice, because Torrisi knew enough to destroy me, and I had no one to protect me, or so I thought. Corrado, as he told me later, listened to everything Ettore said without moving a muscle. When the old man finished, he walked to the desk, set the coffee down on a stack of papers, and asked in a flat voice, "How long has she been working for him?" "Months," Ettore said, "and it doesn't look like it's by choice." Corrado went quiet. Ettore waited, and then Corrado said something Ettore wasn't expecting. "Don't do anything. Don, nothing. I'll handle it." Ettore stood, straightened the scarf inside his jacket, and walked out of the study without arguing, because men with 61 years of service also know when to keep their mouths shut. Days later, Corrado went down to the Tiber. I didn't see this either, but I know, because he told me in the same tone and with the same absence of remorse, that he had Sicilian call Torrisi and arrange a meeting near a bridge on the south bank of the river, the armored car parked 30 meters away. Corrado didn't get out. Sicilian stepped out on the passenger side, walked up to Torrisi, who was waiting against the iron railing with his short beard and the eyes of a man who hadn't been sleeping well, and handed him a brown envelope. Torrisi opened it, went pale, tucked it into the pocket of his coat. Sicilian walked back to the car without saying a word. The engine turned over. The car pulled away. What was inside the envelope I never knew for certain. False information, most likely. Switched names, altered dates, transactions that never happened. Corrado's plan was simple in its design, and cruel in its execution. Feed Torrisi data that was worth nothing, keep the blackmail alive so Torrisi would think he was still in control, and let me go on working at the Cortile Rosso without realizing that both ends of the leash around my neck now belonged to the same man. I still didn't know, but I was already bait. The night Corrado came back to the bar after those days was different from every other. I noticed it in the temperature, not the air's. That was the same heavy, dry Roman autumn. His, something in his posture, in the way he pulled out the chair, in the way his shoulders sat loose inside the jacket. A lightness that didn't match the man I'd come to associate with tense hallways and clipped sentences. He ordered his usual whiskey. I poured it. His fingers brushed mine when he took the glass, and this time his hand didn't pull back or linger. It just stayed there for a fraction of a second before he brought the glass to his lips. He drank slowly, his eyes on the floor of the bar, and asked me, with a disarming ease, "Have you eaten?" "I eat after my shift," I answered, caught off guard. "Eat what?" "Whatever's around." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I've got, Signor Malacarne." He looked at me with the corner of his mouth hitched up in something that was almost humor. "Almost. Corrado," he said. "I've already kissed you in a hallway. I think you can use my first name." I opened my mouth to answer and closed it without a sound, because the heat climbed from my neck to my ears, and I didn't trust my voice to come out in one piece. He noticed. He didn't comment. He went back to the whiskey, and the line of his shoulders relaxed another inch. He knew. He already knew everything. And there, at that table, with the glass in his hand and the question about dinner, he was pretending nothing had changed, because the plan needed me to keep serving, keep listening, and keep reporting to Teresi, as if the world were still the same. I didn't catch it that night. I only caught it later, when the penny dropped along with Teresi's body on the floor of a parking lot. Halfway through my shift, Sicilian appeared behind the counter. I was drying glasses, the damp cloth wrapped around my hand, when his shadow blocked the light from the nearest fixture. He stopped beside me, standing, hands in the pockets of his coat, wearing his usual expression, the expression of a man who doesn't have expressions. "Can I get you something to drink?" I asked, more reflex than offer. "I work for your boyfriend," he said, without moving a muscle in his face. "I can't drink." I choked on the air. "He's not my—" I started, and the sentence died on its own halfway through because I didn't know how to finish it. Sicilian smiled, mouth closed, no teeth, with the economy of a man who rationed his own humor by the drop, and he walked off without adding anything else, because Sicilian was the kind of man who dropped the grenade on the floor and strolled in the opposite direction without turning to watch the blast. I stood there behind the counter with the wet glass in my hand and my face burning, and Juicy, who'd heard the whole thing from the other side, looked at me with one eyebrow raised and her lips pressed tight to keep from laughing. "Don't," I said. I didn't say anything. "Don't. I wasn't going to." "Juicy." Okay. The rest of the night passed without any bigger incidents. Corrado spoke with two men I didn't recognize, signed something Sicilian brought over in an envelope, and drank 2 glasses in 3 hours, which was light for him, and something I shouldn't have known. But I did, because 3 years behind a bar had taught me to track every customer's intake without needing to look at the bottle. When the shift ended and I walked out the back door with my backpack on my shoulder and the exhaustion in my bones, the black car was parked in the alley. Not the car I'd seen on the corner of my building. This one I recognized by the driver, who was Sicilian. The rear door opened. Corrado appeared in the gap, jacket on his lap and tie loosened. "Get in," he said. "I'll take you home. I can take a taxi." "You can, but you won't." It wasn't a threat. It was certainty. His certainty carried that unbearable weight of a man who already knows the answer before he asks the question. I glanced at Sicilian in the front seat, who was staring out at the street with the interest of a man counting lampposts, and I got in the car. The back seat was cold leather, and the inside smelled of coffee, and the cologne I already knew from the night in the office. Corrado didn't sit close. He stayed on his side, arm resting on the window, face turned toward the street, and he didn't say a word the entire ride. Trastevere, Tiber, Testaccio. The car cut through the city in silence, and I sat watching the streetlight slide past the window, feeling his presence on the other side of the seat without needing to confirm it. When Sicilian pulled up in front of my building, Corrado turned to me for the first time. "Good night, Serafina." "Good night," I answered, my hand already on the door handle. "Eat something before you go to sleep." I opened the door. I stepped out. I didn't look back. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs with the key in my hand, and my chest squeezed by something I didn't want to name. Miriam was in her room, light off, the heavy breathing of a woman already asleep. I switched on the lamp in the living room, walked to the window, and looked down. The car was parked there, engine running, lights off. He was waiting for me to turn the light on, so he'd know I was home, safe, on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in a building with cracked tile work. The same thing the black car had done that afternoon at the market. I stood at the window until the car drove off. It took 20 seconds. 20 seconds during which I saw, through the tinted glass of the rear window, the silhouette of him looking up. The car vanished around the bend in the street. I closed the curtain, and in the hallway, taking off the apron, I realized it. The second layer of fabric, the one I tied with a double knot over the first, was getting tight. Not at the bow, the fabric itself. The belly I'd been hiding for weeks was pressing against the seam, and when I tied the knot that night, I had to pull one extra loop compared to the week before. I leaned against the hallway wall, the apron dangling from my hand, and I thought, with the cruel clarity that only shows up at the end of the day, when the body stops and the mind doesn't, in a week, maybe 2, the belly was going to show. It didn't matter how many layers I wore, how many aprons I stacked, how many loose jeans I bought. The body was doing what the body does, and I had no way to negotiate with it. I needed to get out of that bar. But what I didn't know yet, and wouldn't find out until it was too late, was that getting out wasn't up to me anymore. Chapter 5. The Bullet and the Question. The Cortile Rosso was packed that night, fuller than usual, and I felt the exhaustion in every lap I made between tables. It wasn't the familiar kind of tired. It was a new heaviness, distributed in a way I couldn't control, a sluggishness that came from the inside and forced me to breathe deeper between one tray and the next. The past few weeks had taken their toll. My body was shifting at its own pace, without asking my permission, and I moved across the floor feeling like I was sharing the space with someone who didn't have a face yet. Juicy was working the opposite side of the counter, covering the tables near the entrance with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd made that round 1,000 times. I had the back, including the table that was now mine by decree, though that night it was occupied by men I didn't recognize. Corrado wasn't there. When I asked about Sicilian, because his absence rearranged the floor in a way I only noticed when he was gone, Juicy shrugged and said he'd left to handle something in Ostia. I accepted it without a second thought. There was no reason to question a message relayed over the clatter of glasses. Close to midnight, the owner called me to the counter. "Serafina, go down to the garage and bring up the case of grappa I left in the storeroom this morning. Juicy's alone on the floor. I need you back quick." I hesitated with the cloth in my hand. The garage, at that hour, was deserted. I knew because I'd been down there before and had never liked the silence underneath the building. But the owner had already turned his back. The floor was packed, and Juicy couldn't handle both halves alone. I dropped the cloth on the rim of the sink and headed toward the ramp that led down to the underground garage. The ramp was long, with a grade that made my knee protest, and the fluorescent tube overhead flickered at an uneven interval that stung my eyes. The air down there was nothing like the floor above, cold, damp, reeking of concrete, motor oil, and something metallic that coated the back of my throat. The parked cars threw long shadows under the lamps, and the silence was the kind that makes you hear your own breathing too loud. I walked slowly, one hand on the railing, and the double apron tugging at my waist. My footsteps echoed off the concrete and bounced back on a delay that felt intentional. The storeroom was at the far end, behind a metal door painted gray, and I could already see the handle when the movement flickered at the edge of my vision. Beppe Teresi stepped out from between 2 parked cars, and for the first time I saw that face up close. It was a face that had aged past its years. The short, badly shaved beard grew in patchy tufts over skin, weathered by sun and sleepless nights. His eyes were bloodshot, with circles so deep they looked permanent, and his mouth was pressed into a thin line I recognized. The mouth of a man who'd been chewing on his own fury for too long and was about to spit it on someone. He moved fast, faster than I'd expected from a man his size. Before I could step back, before my body could even register the danger and tell my legs to react, he slammed me against the concrete pillar and his left hand closed around my throat. The impact emptied my lungs. The back of my head struck the concrete and I saw white sparks at the edges of my vision. Bursts of light that flared and vanished while the pain radiated from the base of my skull. His hand was large, fingers spread wide, and his thumb pressed sideways against my windpipe, choking off the air without crushing it. It wasn't meant to kill fast. It was meant to pin me in place. His face came close enough for me to catch his breath. Cheap cigarettes, reheated coffee, an acidity that turned my stomach more than the hand on my throat. "You used me," he said, voice low and thick, every word shoved out between his teeth. "You and him. Both of you used me." I tried to deny it. I opened my mouth, and what came out was a strangled sound, shapeless, the beginning of a vowel that died before it could become a word. His fingers tightened. The pressure on my neck climbed, and my field of vision narrowed, the edges going dark while the center became absurdly sharp. I could see every pore on his face, every bristle of the badly shaved beard, every red vein threading through his eyes. "Cattle caught between 2 fences," he growled, his mouth centimeters from mine. "You know what that is. You. And inside the absence of air, with the brutal clarity the body finds when it's near its limit. I understood. Corrado knew. He'd known about the blackmail. He'd known about Teresi. He'd known about the Sicilian. He'd known all of it. The gentle approach of the past few weeks, the car that drove me home, the question about dinner, the brush of his fingers when I handed him the glass, the line about using his first name, all of it was bait. All of it was a trap. He had set the board with the patience of a man playing alone, moved every piece into position, and I was the piece at the center because I was the one Teresi would come for. The hand squeezed harder. I felt my legs buckle, my knees fold, and the thought arrived with a strange lucidity, the way the body thinks when almost nothing is left, a clean line of consciousness slicing through the fog. If I pass out, he kills the baby with me. The instinctive hand that shields the belly never got a chance to rise. The shot got there first. Short, clean, no echo. A dry crack that split the air of the garage, struck the concrete walls, and was gone before I had time to close my eyes. Teresi released my throat. His eyes stayed open for a second, without expression, without surprise, without anything, and then his body tipped sideways. His shoulder hit the hood of the nearest car, and he slid to the floor with the heavy slowness of things that don't come back. Corrado was 3 meters away, gun raised, arm steady, face wearing nothing at all. Behind him, emerging from the dark end of the garage with the calm of a man arriving at a scheduled appointment, Sicilian appeared. The thing in Ostia was this. They had both known Teresi would come that night, because Corrado had planted the right information in the right place and waited for the rage to do the work of delivering the target to the trap. I dropped to my knees, not from fear, from rage. The rage surged up from the pit of my stomach and burned through the throat Teresi had just released. I was on my knees on the filthy concrete, hand at my neck, and the taste of blood in my mouth from biting my own tongue. And I looked at Corrado with everything I had inside me in that moment. Fury, betrayal, relief, and disgust fused into one thing I didn't know how to name, scorching through me with an intensity that made me shake. Sicilian helped me to my feet. His grip was firm and impersonal, a professional doing his job. No extra kindness and no coldness either, just the pressure needed to get me upright. Corrado holstered the gun under his jacket, glanced down at his own cuff where a spatter of blood had landed, from Teresi, who had fallen against him, and said, in the voice that didn't ask, "Get in the car." I got in, not because I wanted to, because there was nowhere in the world to go with a marked throat, blood in my mouth, and a belly full of a life that depended on me staying on my feet. The back seat of the armored car was dark, cold leather, and the engine was already running when Sicilian climbed in the front and rolled up to the exit ramp. Corrado got in the other side and shut the door without hurry. The car pulled out of the garage, turned onto the main street, and began climbing toward the Via Appia Antica. I fell apart. I screamed all of it, that he'd known about the blackmail and hadn't told me, that he'd used me for weeks as bait, as a piece in a game I never asked to play, that he'd planted false information on Teresi knowing the man would come after me, that he was a monster, that he was just like every other man I'd ever seen at that back table, that I hated him, that he had no right to kiss me in hallways and ask whether I'd eaten dinner while he was building an execution around me. I screamed until my voice splintered, until my breath gave out, until the car went silent because I had no more air left to keep the fury standing. Corrado listened to all of it without moving. His bloodied cuff rested on his thigh, and he was cleaning it with a white handkerchief, slowly, fold by fold, with the focus of a man tending to a small detail while the world burns down around him. He didn't defend himself. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to explain. When I stopped, gasping, face wet and hands trembling in my lap, he folded the handkerchief one last time, tucked it into the pocket of his jacket, and turned. His voice came out different, lower, rougher, a voice I'd never heard from him before. No control, no polished courtesy, nothing standing between what he felt and what he said. How many weeks? The whole car went cold. I looked at him. I looked at the hand resting on his thigh. So still it seemed to belong to a different man. I looked at his eyes, which weren't accusing or angry. They were waiting. And I understood, my stomach plummeting, that he knew this too. He had known for a while. Since the double apron. Since the tray carried on my hip. Since the night in the office when I froze and made up a lie he didn't buy. I truly fell apart then. Not the rage kind. The other kind. The one that comes when there's no wall left to hold up. I told him everything. Gaetano Risotto. The boyfriend I'd had for 3 years. Engineer. Quiet. Big hands. An easy laugh. A way of looking at me when I spoke that made me feel like my words carried weight. His mother, Elenia, had died of illness the year before, and he never talked about her without his voice changing. Killed in a car accident on the Via Salaria, weeks ago, on a dry curve, on a night with no rain. The car flipped, and I got the call from the hospital when there was nothing left to receive. I told him I'd found out about the pregnancy a week after the funeral, sitting on the bathroom floor, a towel draped over my shoulders and the test in my hand. That I had no family in Rome, that my mother had called once after the funeral and never called again, that the Cortile Rosso paid for the crib, the prenatal visits, the pack of diapers I'd stashed in the hallway closet, because hoarding diapers was the only way I'd found to believe that this child was real and was actually going to arrive. Corrado didn't interrupt. He didn't move his hands. He didn't look away. When I finished, my voice wrecked, and my palms open in my lap. He wiped the cuff one last time, more reflex than need, and looked at me with dark, very still eyes. "From now on," he said, and his voice carried a weight that wasn't a threat. It was an oath. "You and that child are mine. Nobody touches either of you." I didn't know if that sentence was a promise or a verdict. I didn't know if the heat rising in my chest was relief or fear. I sat there watching his profile carved by the light of the street lamp sweeping past the window, and I thought, with the exhaustion of someone who'd already burned through every ounce of rage in her body, that maybe promise and verdict were the same thing when they came from a man like that. The car turned in through the villa gate and stopped on the gravel drive. When the door opened, a woman with white hair, tall and with a hard gaze, was waiting at the top of the front steps. Her posture was straight, arms at her sides, and the porch light illuminated a face that looked like it had been beautiful for an entire lifetime, and now wore severity in place of vanity. Adelaide Malacarne, his mother. Corrado stepped out of the car, extended his hand, and helped me down without hurry. I felt the gravel under my soles and the night air on my face, and for a second the world felt absurdly vast after the inside of that car. Adelaide didn't move. Her eyes traveled from her son's face to mine, then to my belly, then back to her son, in a reading that took 2 seconds and said everything it needed to say. "Not now, Mama," Corrado said, walking past her with my hand still in his. Adelaide didn't answer. She stayed on the steps with her spine straight and her mouth closed, and I held the image of that woman in my memory without knowing why. Maybe because her gaze, cold and measured, reminded me that the man who had just sworn to protect me had been raised by someone who didn't forgive easily. Chapter 6. The Lemon Grove. Corrado brought me to a guest room on the 2nd floor. We climbed the main staircase without a word, crossed a wide corridor lined with paintings I didn't have the strength to take in, and he stopped before a dark wooden door, pushed it open, and flicked on the light inside with a quick motion. The room was large, a wide bed dressed in white sheets, a dresser, an armchair beside the window, and a bathroom with the door left slightly open. It smelled of lavender and old house, and the window faced a garden I hadn't yet seen. Corrado stayed in the doorway. He didn't step inside. His shoulder rested against the frame, his hands sank into the pockets of his trousers, and he watched me with a weariness that mirrored my own. "Rest," he said. "No one touches you here." And he pulled the door shut from the outside. I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the too large bed, shoes still on and hand over my belly, and I tried to sort through what I knew. He had saved my life. He had also used me for weeks without saying a word. He had killed a man in front of me, wiped the blood away with a handkerchief, and asked how many weeks pregnant I was with the same composure he'd used to ask whether I'd eaten. I couldn't tell where the relief ended and the fury began, and the two of them coiled together inside me until I lost track of which was which. I kicked off my shoes. I lay on my side. I pressed my forehead into the pillow and stared at the dark window, listening to the sounds of a villa I didn't yet know. The wind threading through the pines, a dog somewhere far off, the groan of old wood settling. My neck throbbed. The imprint of Teresi's fingers was hot and swollen, and when I touched the spot, the pain arrived alongside the memory of air that wouldn't come in, and the thought that followed. The baby. I ran my hand slowly across my belly, feeling the curve that was already there, and that the apron wasn't going to disguise much longer, and I murmured, to no one, "We're okay." I don't know what time my eyes finally closed. I know that when they opened, the light had already shifted. In the morning, I came downstairs. The main staircase was stone, fitted with a wrought iron railing, worn smooth at the spots where generations of hands had gripped it. The kitchen sat on the ground floor, east side, spacious, hushed, with a pale tile floor and a long marble counter where someone had set out a tray of bread, figs, and a pitcher of water. A housekeeper in a dark blue apron was wiping down the stove and glanced up when I walked in. "Signora Adelaide has gone to Mass," she said, before I could ask. Signor Corrado is in the garden. I ate bread and figs, because my stomach demanded exactly that, and the hunger was so plain and so pressing that I obeyed without thinking. I drank the glass of water leaning against the cold counter, trying to pass for a whole person. Corrado appeared in the kitchen doorway. No jacket, white shirt with the sleeves pushed up past his forearms, the top button undone, the shadows carved deep beneath his dark eyes. He hadn't slept. I could read it in his face, in the way his jaw held a tension the rest of his body was working to conceal. He looked at me, looked at the empty plate, and the corner of his mouth shifted into something that didn't quite reach a smile. "Come with me," he said. I followed. The lemon grove lay on the south side of the villa, bordered by a low stone wall that set the trees apart from the rest of the property. The rows of lemon trees had been planted by his grandmother, as the housekeeper would tell me later, and no one had ever dared rearrange them. The scent was potent, citrus, alive, such a stark contrast to the garage from the night before that my body registered it before my mind could, and I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in hours. The morning light sifted through the leaves with a golden stubbornness that made that strip of ground feel detached from the rest of Rome. There was a stone bench between two trees, worn by time, its surface polished by years of sitting. We sat, him on one end, me on the other, with a hand's width between us that was too wide to be casual and too narrow to be safe. He told me everything. Since when he'd known I understood Sicilian, since the night of the pickup line, when the look I'd fired back had been too precise for a woman who hadn't caught every syllable, since when he'd known about Teresi, since the morning Ettore took the chair across from his desk and said what he said. He laid out the logic of the trap without trying to dress it up, without asking for forgiveness, without pretending he'd done it for me. He'd done it for the family. Teresi was a threat that needed to be severed, and the cleanest method was to let him expose himself on his own. The false information in the envelope, the rent that kept showing up, the nights I'd spent serving tables and feeding back data that was worthless, all of it engineered. Teresi had tried to sell the data to a contact in Naples, and when the names didn't check out, and the dates didn't exist, the contact severed ties, and Teresi grasped that he'd been poisoned by his own source. His rage wasn't about having lost. It was about discovering he'd never been in the game to begin with. "And the bar owner?" I asked, because the question had been lodged in my throat since the night before. "He sent me down to the garage alone. Was that you too?" Corrado didn't flinch. "I needed Teresi to find you in an enclosed space. He wasn't going to approach you on a packed floor. The owner got the instruction without knowing the reason. The answer landed in my gut, but I was already braced for the blow. What caught me off guard was that he made no effort to conceal it. And when did this stop being only about the family?" I asked, because I needed to hear it. He went quiet for a stretch. He plucked a leaf from the nearest lemon tree, turned it between his fingers, and let it fall to the ground before answering. "I don't know. I wish it were clean. I wish I could tell you I kept the two things separate, but I can't pinpoint the day I stopped watching you for the table and started watching you for myself." "And the pregnancy?" I asked, my voice dropping. "When did you figure it out?" "A while ago," he answered, looking at the lemons ahead of him, and not at me. "The way you handled the tray changed. You shifted the weight to your hip instead of your arms. You blocked your belly with your elbow every time someone passed by too fast. And the night in the office, when you froze, it wasn't fear of me. It was fear I'd feel it." I swallowed hard. He was right. And the fact that he was right was the most terrifying and the most comforting thing I'd felt in weeks. We sat in silence for a long time. The breeze stirred the lemon trees, and the citrus scent deepened, and I stared at my hands in my lap, and at his hands resting on his knee, and I realized the rage was still there, but it had shifted shape. It wasn't fury anymore. It was hurt, and hurt I could carry without screaming. "What happens to me now?" I asked. "You stay here as long as you want. You leave when you want. Nobody forces you into anything." He turned to me for the first time, and his eyes were weary in a way I'd never witnessed. Stripped of the armor, stripped of the calculation, stripped of anything standing between him and me. "But I need you to understand one thing. I'm not letting you walk out of this gate alone while the Malikarn name can be used against you. And it can." I understood that this was a gilded cage. But I also understood that, on the other side, the baby and I would be in a cage with no gate and no one standing guard. I chose to stay. In the afternoon, the garden was still. The light had changed, lower, warmer, and we were still there, on the same bench, closer than before. He had told me about his father, the murder inside the villa, the body he'd discovered himself, the mistrust it had rooted in him from that day forward. I had told him about my grandmother, the Sicilian I'd absorbed in her Catania kitchen, the sayings she liked to repeat, the way she taught me that language is a weapon that hides better than a knife. We exchanged fragments of a past we weren't obligated to share, and every fragment offered was a section of wall coming down. He kissed me there, among the lemons. It wasn't like the hallway, fast and stolen. It was slow, carrying a tenderness I hadn't known existed inside that body. His hand cradled my face with care, his thumb tracing my jawline, and when his mouth met mine, I tasted coffee and a decision that had already been made by the two of us, without either of us needing to say it out loud. We went upstairs together, by the side staircase, in silence, his footsteps on the stone, mine right behind, and between us the weight of everything we already knew and everything we hadn't yet done. He opened the door to his suite and looked at me for a moment before he touched me. I nodded. He eased the door shut. He kissed my forehead first, then my mouth. His hands traveled carefully down my waist, and in his touch I felt the awareness of the weight I was carrying. He knew why my waist was thick, and the gentleness with which he held it made my eyes sting. He whispered in Sicilian, his mouth against my ear, that I was too beautiful to be real. I answered in the same language that he was spinning a pretty lie, and he laughed under his breath, a quiet laugh that hummed against my skin, and that I stored away as proof that this man was capable of laughing. He undressed me slowly, piece by piece, with an attention that wasn't hurried. It was devotion. When his fingers grazed the curve of my belly, his open palm rested there a beat longer, and his thumb traced the taut skin with a lightness that made me hold my breath. He met my eyes, and I saw something there that wasn't desire. It was reverence, an intensity that frightened me more than any word he'd ever spoken to me. Ours, he whispered, his hand still on my belly, and the word on his lips sounded not like a promise of the future, but like a fact he'd already settled on, one the rest of the world would learn to accept. He guided me to the bed. He laid me down with a care that contradicted everything I'd ever witnessed from him, and he positioned himself at my side, propped on his elbow, his whole body angled toward me, his gaze traveling over my face before drifting lower. His mouth found my neck, my collarbone, the hollow between my breasts, and every spot he touched was left smoldering. I gripped the sheet with both hands when his mouth moved further down, and I heard myself saying things I hadn't planned, broken syllables that spilled out in Italian and in Sicilian, and in no language at all, because my body had overthrown reason, and reason offered no objection. When he returned and settled between my legs, bracing his weight on his arms to keep from pressing on my belly, I opened my eyes and found him looking down at me with an expression I'd never seen in him. Vulnerability. Raw, exposed, without the armor he wore at every table and in every hallway and in every armored car of his life. And it was that expression, more than any touch, that made me release the sheet and pull his face down to mine. He entered me slowly, with a measured depth that arched my back and made me close my eyes. I felt every inch, every unhurried, deep stroke, withdrawing almost entirely before returning, with a patience that was agony and tenderness bound together. He was watching me, his eyes locked on my face, attuned to every reaction, and the pressure of his hands on my hips was firm and steady, an anchor I hadn't realized I needed. "Look at me," he said, his voice raw, and I opened my eyes. The rhythm climbed, without losing the depth, without losing the attention. He quickened until every stroke drew a sound from me I couldn't contain. The room filled with the breathing of both of us, with the low sounds that escaped him against my mouth, with the rhythmic collision of bodies. I felt the tension rise past the point of return, and when I shattered, my entire body clenching in waves that held him inside me, he let out a low groan against my neck and gave in at the same instant, his body going rigid in one final deep thrust before he released everything he'd been holding back. We stayed there, breath returning slowly, bodies still joined, sweat cooling on our skin. He didn't pull away. He remained heavy and close, his forehead pressed to my shoulder, and his hand drifted down to my belly and stayed there, open, warm, covering what was his by choice, and not by blood. I placed my hand over his. I closed my eyes. His voice came low and unhurried, carrying a humor I hadn't expected, and that, for precisely that reason, landed dead center. "You're going to have to learn formal Italian. My mother doesn't speak dialect in public." I laughed, a laugh that came out wet, that caught me off guard, that climbed from the same place that hours earlier had only produced rage. It was humor at the most exposed moment, lodged in the exact fracture where laughter shouldn't fit, and that was why it belonged there more than anywhere else. He pulled the sheet over both of us. His hand stayed over my hand, which stayed over my belly, and I let myself stay, because resisting that warmth would have meant fighting the only good thing that had happened to me in months. I curved my body into his, felt his arm close around me on instinct, even in sleep, and I shut my eyes, and I slept, all the way through, no dreams, for the first time in weeks. A shame that this would be the last time. Lena here, that wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. 3 months sleeping beside him, finally at peace. 3 months believing that after everything, real life had begun. A silent apartment, her belly growing, and a man who had taken her in even with another man's child in her womb. Serafina began to believe she was saved, until the afternoon she opened the wrong drawer in his office. Inside the envelope bearing Gaetano's name, there were 3 photos, a receipt signed in black ink, and a single word scrawled with violence. Franny. The date was from 3 days before the accident. The signature was Corrado's. Serafina stood frozen, the paper trembling between her fingers, as the truth tore apart everything she had tried to rebuild. 7 months of life were growing inside her. Then the question surfaced, cruel, inevitable, impossible to contain, and Serafina wasn't prepared for the answer. The man who stroked her belly every night, was he the same man who had ordered the murder of her child's father? Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.